Hey, welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at using AI to automate the translation of our application to a number of different supported languages. I'm going to share how I built an AI agent that does the translation for me, and how I integrated that agent into my application to automate the translation process. So let's take a look. All right, let's just orient ourselves a little bit. This is an application I've been developing that allows you to kind of discover adventures or trails or experiences near you, and allows you to rate them and just find out information about them. And I want this application to be accessible throughout the world. So whatever language you speak, I would like it to present itself in that language. So as I'm developing this, putting text in the views like find your outdoors and search by city park or trail name, and all these other pieces of information, these are all in English. So I have a feature in the application that automatically detects your location via your IP address. So there's an API you can use, and it'll tell you kind of the language that probably is spoken around that IP address. The application then has the information to automatically adapt and show you information in your native language. In addition, at the very bottom, there is a drop down where I can select a language if I want. So that's the challenge. If I select Spanish, I would like the application to translate all of my English text into Spanish. And so you can see it that's done that right now. Let's dig in a little bit, and I'll show you how I use an AI agent that I built to help me do these initial translations. Okay, so the AI engine that I'm going to be using is OpenAI's API. If you have a different choice for an AI engine, the same concept and all the rest of the video applies. I'm going to show you how we're going to use this in a second. So first of all, that application I demoed was a Laravel application. So it's built in PHP. OpenAI has a PHP package that you can use. You can see it here. And if you scroll down a little bit, it tells you how to get started. There's a composer require. And if I take a look at my composer file, and you can see that I have that package already installed. So that's already set there for us. And you can see over in their GitHub page, they provide a pretty simple example on how to use their API. One best practice is whenever you're using an API, never use it directly in your code. Always build some kind of wrapper around that API. And that's a safeguard for that in the future. If you ever decide you want to swap that API to some other provider, it's easier to do. So I'm going to show you the wrapper that I built around this LLM, and it's called my LLM helper, and it's a pretty simple wrapper. So you can see it's using the AI API, and on the constructor I'm fetching my API key from my environment. But if you take a look at the lines 23 through about 29 and compare that to the example over here on the right, they're pretty much exactly the same. So I'm setting my API key, I'm calling this create method with my model and my messages. And then in the end, I'm getting some response back from the AI engine. And one of the challenges with AI is you have to engineer the prompt. That's what they call it, prompt engineering, to get an acceptable response. If you don't engineer the prompt correctly, then you will end up with possibly what they call hallucinations, where the OpenAI engine is just kind of guessing or making stuff up. And you can also end up with answers to your question or answers to your prompt that don't really match your desired output, exactly what you're looking for. So we're talking more about prompt engineering in a little bit, but I'm just going to point out here that I have this messages, and I'm using this prompt class that I'm feeding in from my prompt builder. And we're going to take a look at that in a second, but I'm grabbing all the messages from the prompt builder. So let's take a peek at prompt builder here. Now prompt builder is a pretty simple class too, but it's setting me up for some more advanced stuff here in the future. You can see the messages function that we've called previously. It's just returning this variable, and that variable is an array of messages. And what prompt builder does is it really provides these kind of functions, add system message and add user message mostly. There's also a generic just add message where you can feed in the role, but I mostly use this add system and add user messages. OpenAI API has this concept of a role, and these roles are kind of different, I'd say, voices. And so the system message is an inner voice. When you feed a message in using the system message role, you're kind of telling the AI engine what to think, how to think about itself, what's its identity. And you're really setting up the AI engine to think about the environment and what its role is in answering your question. User messages are more external messages. And so those are like me asking the question that I want to get answered. So we'll look at both of these in a second. But now that we've covered the prompt builder and the LLM helper, let's take a look at I have an endpoint here. This is a route. It's a test route. And right now it's just die dumping here. So I'm going to take a look at that. We'll just show you this here. So I'll refresh. We're going to hit the die dump here. And I'm just going to pump up the text here so we can see it a little bit better. Over here then, I have a couple of helpers. So I'm going to get rid of this. And the first one is a test OpenAI helper. I'm using the prompt builder. And I'm going to feed this prompt that I'm building into the LLM helper. And we're going to get the response and then die dump the response. Before we look at the response, just look at the prompt. Have a system message. You will answer the following question as if you are a technology expert. I'm setting the identity or the role of the AI engine. So now it knows who it is, and then it can kind of behave or answer with respect to that person. And then here's my question. What are the top 5 backend languages for web development? What are the top 5 front-end frameworks? So you can see the questions that I've asked. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll get the response. That response was pretty quick, and I'll show you why in just a second here, but you can see my questions being answered by the AI engine. So for backend development and web development, the top 5 languages are, and it shows you what they are. And then here's the 4 front-end frameworks. Here's what the front-end frameworks are. Now, why was this so fast? You can see here over at the LLM helper, I'm using a bit of caching. And my key is, if you look at the prompt, I serialize all the messages out into a big long string and I MD5 that string. And so that's my key for my cache. If I find that in my cache, I'm just going to return it right away. And what that means is if I've already asked the question before, so if exactly the same prompt, I'm not going to ask the LLM again. I'm just going to grab it from the cache. So if it's not in the cache, then it obviously goes to the LLM to go get the response. And so then I put it on the cache, and you can see I add it to the cache for 60 minutes. So this response is good for 60 minutes. And that's mostly good because most of the time when I ask questions, the response isn't going to be that dynamic. It's just not going to matter that much. And there's no use in me burning the API. I'm paying per token or per request. No sense in me burning that cache if I don't have to do that. So just cache it for 60 seconds. So I want to take a look next at the agent interface and how I build agents. Again, we talked a little earlier about prompt engineering, how it's important that we engineer prompts. This concept of agents it's like a pattern that you can use to fine-tune these prompts. Now I know that there's agent libraries and agent packages that you can use, and it helps you a little bit. Sometimes I like to build some of these pieces myself. So it allows me to kind of understand a little bit more under the hood how AI and the large language models really work. So let's take a look at this agent interface. So the agent interface I have is pretty simple, right? There's only one function here. It's called work. And so every agent that I build is going to implement this agent interface. All right, so the next thing I want to take a look at is an agent base class. And if you take a look at this base class implements that interface. So it's going to have a work function. And if we scroll down, we will see it down here, and we'll get to that in a second. But we're starting to see some of the structure that I put around these agents so that the prompt is getting built automatically. And so we can see at the constructor itself takes in a number of different parameters. And there's quite a bit here. Usually I don't like to have my constructors this long, but my work function, as you know, it doesn't take any parameters. All of the data about my question that I want to ask to the LLM has to get fed into this constructor. So it's a bit beefier than I normally like on my constructors, but some of these things are optional. If you don't have to use them at the end, you don't need to use them, but there are some required ones at the very beginning. And when we take a look at the translation agent, we'll go through these a little bit more specifically in what they do. But a lot of these we're helping the LLM with its identity. What's your role? What's your background? Then we're taking the goal. This is the goal that you need to try to achieve. We're providing some context. This is usually where we're providing it some additional information, and we're also asking the question. I like to provide a set of instructions to the LLM. You'll see this in a second. But these instructions help the LLM formulate its thoughts, if it has those, and provides better results. Output format. So sometimes I'll give it an example of the output format. Hey, I want you in this format. Or I might tell it's in JSON, so I can do that also. There's this update context, and you can see the context is one of the pieces that I passed in. This currently isn't used anywhere, so I could probably get rid of this, but it's just a function call where I can update this context dynamically. So you can imagine situations where maybe I build an agent with a certain context and I ask a certain question, but then I want that same agent now to answer a different question. So I could easily add to the context, just like that. And then here's the work function. And the work function is just building a prompt. You can see it has this prompt it starts to build with the prompt builder, adds a system message, you have the following role, and it provides the role that I pass into the constructor. You have the following background. There's my background. If it is JSON, then I add a system message that your results should be valid JSON format. I find that explicitly telling the LLM over and over again sometimes about JSON is important. And you'll see down here, I think there's some other formatting things about JSON. Here's my context. My context is an array that I passed in. You can see that here. It's an array of strings. I'm going to loop over every string in there and add that as a user message. So here's information about this key. And this array is really key values. This is information about this key. And I'll show you how I use those keys in a little bit. But sometimes I feed the LLM a bit of data and I need to label that data. And that's what that key is. I might say the default language is English and the language I want you to translate it to is another label, and that's going to be French or Spanish or whatever it is. So you will see how we use those in a second. I add the goal as a user message. If there are instructions, you don't need them all the time. It's an optional one. I add the instructions in there. If there is output, same thing. I put the output in there. If it's JSON, here, I'm being overly explicit again. Hey, you need to be this compliant with the JSON. And then it's a simple call to the LLM helper with the prompt, and I return the response. That's all this agent base does. Provides kind of a lot of that structure. Okay, so next I want to just take a look at a translator agent, and this extends that agent base. At the very top you're going to see a lot of the magic sauce here that happens. So the role, these are all this is all the information that I feed into the constructor. So we're really defining, what this translator agent is. So what's your role? You're a language translator. What's your background? It's almost like we're teaching it its skill set, right? Hey, you're an expert translating English to other languages. What's your goal? Follow the instructions provided and create translations. Here's the instructions. You have developed the following process that generates the best possible results. And I give it step-by-step instructions. If we take a look at the instructions, we can start to see some of these variables that I talked about earlier. This context has these key value pairs. So here, you'll be provided a language code of the language you're translating from a variable called from language. And that was, when we go back to the base, that was these contexts, this key. Here is the information about the from language, and then I would put in the value. So it has all of those keys. You'll be provided a list of phrases in the from language in the variable called English texts. And so I will feed it in the context something called English texts. And this is an example. So I even provided an example. Each phrase will be on its new line. For example, something like this. You'll be provided the language code of the language you're translating in the variable called to language. And then for each phrase, create a translation from language to the to language. So that's the instruction set. Output format, I'm telling it pretty much I would like to see that you return this in JSON. So your output should be translated text. Again, I'm repeating this. I know that this is already under the hood in my base, but I'm saying it again as the user. I want your output to be in JSON. So as I developed this, I found issues where it would leave off commas on some of my JSON, and then they wouldn't be proper JSON. So I added in extra lines sometimes just to help it remember, hey, you need a comma in the last line. Here's an example of the desired output format. So here's the text to be translated. Here's the translation. Here's another phrase. Here's a translation. And the commas that I would like to see in place. When you create this translator agent, let's look at the constructor. So it has an array of English texts, has a from language and a to language. The context, here's where I'm setting those variables. So this context is just an array. And the from language, English text, I'm going to implode this with the PHP end of line character so that I'm meeting my input format. My input format was this. And I'm doing that down here. And then I'm just calling the base agent constructor. You notice I don't have a work method here. The work is already under the hood. It's already there. This agent exposes another function called translate. And this translate function takes the work. You can see the output from here. It calls the base method work, and I get my translations. And that translation is just a JSON string. And so I take those translations, I fix up a couple of things where it had some common issues in output formatting. I fix those up, and then I JSON decode it, and I get the return response. And that's all there is. So this is my translator agent. So let's take a look at that translator agent in practice. Again, go back to my controller. I'm going to comment this one out, and I'm going to uncomment this. And we take a look at the test translation agent. So here's my texts that I want to translate. Again, it's an array. Hello, what is your name? My name is Bob. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day. So 3 texts. The from language is in English, so that's in English. So then in my application, I have these in my config, this supported languages. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So here's my supported languages. Everything I want my web app to be translated to. So English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, so you can see all these different languages. It's important that I use kind of the international code for the language, and then here is the translated, what it looks like in their language. So English, Portuguese, Spanish. So I go back to my example here. Then for each one of these supported languages, I'm going to loop over. I'm going to call my translator agent with the texts from language and the to language, and get the translation, and I'm just going to build up this translations, and then I'm going to die dump this out to the output over here. So I think we're all set up. We're calling that one now. Let's go ahead and see what the response is. So this one, I don't think I've hit this in the 60-minute time period. So it is going through, and it's going to ask the LLM to do the translations again. Once it's done it once again, those are all translated for us. How I really use this translator agent in the application, we'll see in a little bit, but it doesn't rely on that caching, and we just only ask for translations that aren't in our translation files. We'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. So English to English is, I'm not expecting it to change anything here. Hello, I don't think it did any changes, doesn't look like. All right, English to Portuguese would look like this. Hello, what is your name? Hola. And if you speak Portuguese, you would probably know better. Are these translations perfect? Probably not. I think as the LLM improves, these translations will get better over time. But you'll see how I really use these in the application is this translator agent provides me the initial values for the translations. Somebody has to eventually come through and do a final review, but most of the work is done and it's in place. And then we're just kind of finalizing any small changes or tweaks. So hopefully these are pretty good. Spanish, hola, ¿cuál es tu nombre? Mi nombre es Bob. Adios. So feels like it's pretty close. Again, are they perfect? I'm not sure. But you can see all the French. You can see Italian. Down here we can start to see Turkish. So that's Turkish. Russian. Korean. Japanese. You can see Mandarin, Chinese, and you can see Arabic. And then now that this is all cached, that prompt has been cached, my next time I hit it, it should go pretty quick. And so you can see the response was a lot quicker there. All right, so now let's take a look and see how that translator agent is integrated into our Laravel application to help us automate the translations for our application. So you can see the application here on the right. And for example, this find your outdoors text. It's something I want to be translated. It's one of the titles. I don't want that in English all the time. You can see that over here. So here's the blade view. This is the index.blade view for this page. It says find your outdoors. But you'll see that this text now is surrounded by this _x helper. And I do know that Laravel itself has a translation helper, _, and we'll see how this integrates with that in just a second. So if I go and I see what this function looks like, this function's pretty easy. It's just a helper that's in my helpers.php file. This file gets loaded all the time, but you can see this _. It takes some text. If the text is null, it just returns the null. But if it's not null, it's going to come down through here. It's going to use this translate text. And this translate text we'll look at this class in just a second, but it has this method called translate, and it takes the text in there and it returns that whatever it translates to. So I'm using an app here to resolve an instance of this translate class. And if I look at the app service provider, you're going to see that I've set this class up to be a singleton. So there's only going to be one instance per request of this. It'll hit the constructor of it once, and then the class will just be available. In this helpers method, if this is the first time you hit it, it'll create that class. Otherwise, if like there's multiple instances of text to be translated on this page, it's going to use that same instance of that translation class. So let's take a look at that translation class now. And we can see it here. So here's translate. On the constructor, it has the default language. It knows that. And then it's going to fill in these default translations. And default translations is an array of strings. There is this read translation function, which is a public method, and we'll look at this in a second. But it takes the default language or any language that you want. So you can see down here, read translations, takes in English, let's say. We're going to get the translation file. So whatever the translation file, there's a lang/language. So it'd be lang/en.json. It's going to grab that file, it's going to read it, and it's going to get all the JSON content. So let's take a look at the lang en.json. So this file is essentially the data file for everything I want to be translated. So for English, it's just a direct mapping. It says advanced maps. Not a big deal. The English does not really need to be translated, but you'll come over here and let's see if we can find this find your outdoors right here. So you can see on line 78, find your outdoors. When you translate it to English, what it's really going to be is find your outdoors. Nothing really being translated. I could use variables here instead. So instead of find your outdoors, I could put hero title. I don't like doing that. I just like to put the text in itself. But this is my translation file for English. English isn't, again, it's not really doing much work on the translation. If you ask for an English text called first name, it's going to give you first name back. So I go back to translate. My helpers method was calling translate. It's returning this. So let's see what this translate function does then. So if it's null, it doesn't do anything. It just returns the null text. Here's where the automation comes in. So if the text I'm looking for, if it's not in, that key doesn't exist in my default translations, then I'm going to add that to my default translations. I sort, that's why you see all this text here being sorted. So it's sorted by whatever language it is. I sort it by the key there, and then I'm going to update this translation file. And the update the translation file takes the language, which is the default, which is English, and all the translations, and it just JSON dumps and it rewrites that file. So every single time in my application that I put one of those _x functions and I put that text in there, as a developer, I'm really building up this en.json file. Didn't do any translations, but at the end of this, my en.json file, every time I hit a page with one of those _x, I'm building up my data that needs to be translated. So just to drive this workflow back home one more time, I put anything I want to be translated in my blades using this _x helper. This is what I want to be translated. This helper then uses my translate class to fill. This is where it fills the en.json file full of everything that I want to be translated. In the end, every time I hit a page with these _x functions, everything that's not translated will end up in this file. And then I just return the translated text, based upon the locale for the app. And here's where I'm using the Laravel helper. So this is actually the Laravel version of the _ function, which does all the translation. So based upon the key and the locale, it's going to do the translation for me. As a developer then, I just go through my day and I write blade commands, and anytime I come up upon some label or something that eventually I want it to be translated, I use the _x helper, and that's it. And you can see them a number of times. So all of these _x things are labels or titles or text that are going to be in the page, and I would like them to be translated. So you can see those throughout this blade. Okay, so at this point, we have this automated method, this helper, _x helper, that's a part of my Blade templating language now, that I can use to automatically build my translation file. And this is the English to English translation file, so there's not going to be any real translations here going on, but that's the word I want to be translated, and here's its translation in English. Here's the word I want to be translated, downhill skiing, and that's what it looks like in English. So this English to English translation might seem like it doesn't matter, but what this file now it represents is all the data that I want to feed to my LLM eventually and get the real translations. So let's look and see how that process is done. So it all starts with this translate command. Let's take a look at that. So here's a command. I can run it manually, or I can schedule it to be run once an hour or whatever it is, once a minute. What it does is it takes all the languages, so all the supported languages, it gets them from my config file. If I want to add a new supported languages, I just add another language to the config file. Easy enough. And then I run my command. So what it does is it goes over every one of those supported languages, and then eventually it creates a translate job and it queues that job. Let's take a look at the translate job. So the translate job obviously takes the language and it stores that. This is what language I want to translate into. And here we run into that translate class again. We saw this earlier. Let's go and open this back up. But this is earlier we were using this translate function, which returned the _. But we're going to look at a couple of other things we saw it do previously, which is read a translation file in a certain language. And we also see it update a translation file given the language and the translations. So this translate job is going to use these two methods here, and we're going to take a look at that in a second. Here's where it creates a new translator. The default language is this. This is the language we're coming from. Here are the default translations. Again, the default translations are everything that I got built up in my en.json file. And that was automatically just built it automatically as we built out our Blade templates using that _x helper function. So all those translations, I get them here. I sort them. I do have an exit early. If the language is the default language, there's no translations to do. And that's why you always see on the English template, there's nothing here. Downhill skiing is downhill skiing. So everything is the same. It doesn't really ever change this. This is more of my input data. Doesn't change that data at all. Otherwise, what it does next is it uses this translators function called read translations, and it reads the language, the translations for the language that we're currently translating to. So imagine we ask this to translate to Spanish, so it'll be ES. So here I'm reading all the Spanish translations based upon the ES. And just take a look at that for a second here. So if I look at lang's es.json, here's the Spanish file. I'll put it over next to my English one, and we can kind of compare them back and forth. So here's AI features. Here is AI features. And so you can see AI features here. This is how it got translated into Spanish. Is it correct again? I don't know. But this file is the initial file. So a lot of the work is done. And if this is an incorrect translation, then someone needs to come in and type in the correct translation. But a lot of the work is automated to get it to this point now. So my translate job is reading all of those in. So once it has those translations, this is my Spanish translations, and it has my default language translations. It's going to go over the default language translations. And if the key doesn't exist in my Spanish translations, it's going to add it to this untranslated text array that I have. So at the end of this, I have this array that has all the different text strings that I want to have translated. And that we're set up now to use with my agent, which is the work that's being done here. I do chunk this array. So if this array is, say, 1,000 big, I chunk it up into sizes of 10. Otherwise, you do risk the chances that you might bust out of the context window for the AI engine. The OpenAI has a certain context size, and if you get beyond that, you'll get an error. So this is just kind of helping to stay within the context size of the AI engine. I could probably do more than 10, but just chunks of 10 is what it's at right now. Loops over that translated text array, getting chunks of 10. It creates an agent. Again, this is the chunk of 10. Default language is English. This is the language we're translating to, Spanish, and it asks the LLM to do the translation. So once I have the new translations, if I get back an array, which I should, otherwise the translator kind of messed up the formatting. But if it is an array, I loop over the translations and I insert those into my Spanish translations. So now I have a new translation for that. And at the very end, I call update translation, which saves those translations into the Spanish file. So the es.json file, this will create a new one of those, and just save it over there. At the end of this, all of my new untranslated text should now appear in my es.json file. That job then is repeated for every single language that we have. And again, those languages are just part of my config. And I can add more languages as I want. So if I want to support future languages, I just continue to add them. And that's how the translation process works. Because this is a command, I can either run this manually. So I know as a developer, I've added some changes that I want. I can run the translation. Then I can work with, someone who speaks the language natively to make any final tweaks on that language. Or I can do this automatically. I don't really see a need to do it automatically just because my pages aren't, that dynamic. So the content isn't being changed, on the server itself. It's only being changed as a developer. So I make that as part of my development process. But at this point, there is a command that I can run, and it will do all the translations for me. And then finally, I'll just point out is once the translations have been completed, it doesn't change the translation text. So if a translator comes in and says, oh, this isn't really how you would say it differently, and they modify this file, then because the key already exists, it's not going to try to retranslate that for me. It's just going to use whatever the translator put in there as the translation. So it's not going to stomp over any good translations that got corrected here. We've covered a lot. So the application itself, when you hit any web page, it will automatically try to detect your preferred language. And it does that using your IP address. I have a function, I'm not going to cover this, but it's like an IP, there you go, IP geolocator. And it uses an API that you can see here, and it's going to determine all of this information based upon your IP address. This is not necessarily super accurate, especially if you're using a VPN or anything like that. But one of the things it returns is your languages. And so it tries to automatically determine the language that you would prefer to see the website in. Otherwise, it will present it in English, and that's the default. But down here at the very bottom, let's see if I can pump this up a little bit. At the very bottom here, there is this drop down. And this drop down, we'll take a look at this form, but there's my supported languages, which you can see here. But let's take a look at that footer. So this drop down right here is, and again, this is my locale based upon my IP address, United States, Madison, Wisconsin. This is the drop down. This is the supported languages. So it's a language update. I'm looping over all the configured languages, and I have this option here. So if this select ever changes, we're going to submit this form, and it's going to have this language/update. If we go to that controller, here's the update method on that controller. So it's going to get the language, make sure that it's a valid language. If it is, it puts your language in the session. It changes the session language, and from there, all of the desired text gets changed. So I'm going to back down the zoom here a little bit. So let's go ahead and try translating this. So here's my application. You can see our most popular inventions in English. I translate this over to, let's say, Spanish. It'll make a post back, switches over to Spanish, and now you can see all of those __X language, those texts are now displayed in Spanish. So you can see that there. If I wanted to translate to, I don't know, let's go to Mandarin, I can choose Mandarin, and it'll get translated over to Chinese and see all the translations. Are these 100% correct? I assume that they're close. A translator, someone will actually have to go through who speaks that native language and make sure that these are indeed the proper translations. So that's it for this video. Kind of went through the whole thing from, using AI and doing the wrapper to having this agent who will do the translation, how that translation agent is kind of hooked up into the Laravel infrastructure so that I have this helper method, _X, that automatically builds up my translation file that I need to translate. I have this config that holds all the languages that I want to support, and then I just have this job that automatically does the translations for me. So I hope you agree that's pretty simple. If you have questions on this, feel free to ask below. If you enjoy content like this, hit that like button and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.